Welcome everyone to today's Indians session on psychiatric rehabilitation services. Today we have Dr. Deepak sir, who is Associate Professor of Psychiatry in Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services at Newhans, Bangalore. Today's topic will be models of rehabilitation, special focus on vocational rehabilitation. So over to you, Dr. Deepak sir.
Yeah, thanks, Chetan. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining. Today, we're going to talk about models of rehabilitation with a focus on vocational rehabilitation. Now, at the outset, I must acknowledge that it is a difficult time to be talking about vocational rehabilitation because of the COVID-19 crisis and the way that it's altered the way that people are working, and it's altered the way that people are able to access work and various services. But given that, what are the general things that we should know about this topic? So the first thing we should know, of course, is why we are talking about employment. What are the best ways that we can conceptualize vocational rehabilitation, and which model is best? I won't promise you that there are definitive answers to all of these questions, but we'll try and see what we do know in these various topics. So when we think about models of vocational rehabilitation, I think it's important to acknowledge that we need to know about some models of rehabilitation and recovery themselves. Now, this has been covered by my colleague, Dr. Shivkumar, in previous sessions, but we'll briefly go over them. So the first, the most common one that we have perhaps been exposed to and seen is what is called the charity model. And this basically looks at the disabled individual as somebody who requires services to be delivered to him or her, but without actually acknowledging their participation in the process or their inputs in the process. So very often decisions are made for disabled individuals without taking their own inputs. Another model is the medical model. Now, the medical model acknowledges that there could be a problem, that disability is caused by some specific etiology, and that either that person should be treated or that special services should be provided to minimize this person's disability. Again, here, though it is a slightly better model than the charity model, you can see that the onus is on treating the disabled person rather than looking at what the environment does to this person. Now, as again, you've probably already seen in sessions, the model of disability has now changed from a charity model or a medical model to a more social model. And as we'll see later, a rights-based model. Now, the social model highlights the fact that somebody with disability is disabled because of certain conditions that exist in society, which make this person's disability more. So it looks at trying to make the environment more inclusive and trying to shape the environment so that someone with disability is able to maximize their strengths and participate equally. The evolution of the rights-based model, of the social model, is of course the rights-based model. How is it different? Here, it is acknowledged that it is the persons with disabilities' right to be included in society and to make his or her decisions about what they will do, where they will go, and what things should be done to make their lives better. One brief example, as you can see on the slide here, is for a man with an intellectual disability. In the charity model, it would focus on letting this person live in a foster home and giving the burden of care to somebody else. In a medical model, we would look at whether there's a medicine or treatment which could improve this person's problems. In a social model, you will look at how this disability can be minimized by changing this person's environment. But in a rights-based model, we would actually go to the person and ask them, where do you want to live? So the rights-based model is something that the UNCRPD has centralized, and the Rights of Persons with Disability Act has centralized in India. And India is a signatory to the UNCRPD. So given that we know all this, we need to look at then, how is a person's right to work or right to be a participant in society impacted by disability? So when we look at this and we look at the employment of persons with mental illness, an OECD document actually suggests that mental illness not only causes a significant loss of people who could be a part of the labor pool, there are high rates of unemployment for people with mental illness. There are high incidences of absenteeism due to sickness, which could be avoided, and there is reduced productivity at work. Now, the high rates of unemployment in people with mental illness exceed those with other disabilities. This is primarily because of stigma and because the disability due to mental illness can be unique, especially in the fact that it can be dynamic and that it's not very obvious at times to other people, despite the person having disability. It also looks like, despite high unemployment rates, surveys have shown that most clients want to work. In addition, mental health issues cause cognitive impairment, psychotic symptoms, negative symptoms, and of course, environmental factors like stigma, lack of access, and a fear of losing benefits are important. Now, when we talk about fear of losing benefits, this is primarily, again, a lot of this literature is from the West, where people can lose access to certain social services if they are able to earn larger amounts. This is not alien to India as well. Even in India, if people go from, say, a BPL or to APL, they lose access to certain services. So this is a factor that we have to constantly think about and constantly understand how our context modifies. Now, when we look at the extent of need, this is again primarily Western literature, but you can see that in the OECD, 1/3 to a half of the claims of disability are because of MI, mental illness. And we know that young adults, 70% of them, the disability is because of MI. Yeah. And employment rates for people with severe mental illness are around 20%. This is from a Cochrane review in 2015. But you can see that all of these are significantly higher than the corresponding adult population. What are the advantages of employment? One is that there is quality of life is better. People have enhanced income. There is increased self-esteem. There are better social skills. Symptom improvement often is a happy side effect of employment. There is a decreased number of hospital admissions, and there can be destigmatization. But then, on the other hand, unemployment causes social isolation and economic and social deprivation. And this results in a further reduction in probability of obtaining a job. So we can see here how a cycle can be set up in which somebody who is already unemployed can lose their ability to participate in the job market over time. Another factor which isn't listed here is that often people with mental illness suffer mental illness in a relatively younger age. And when they do, many of their most productive years are lost. In this regard, it can be difficult for them to explain to potential employers and to potential in interviews as to why they have a gap in their CVs or why they have not pursued work before this. So what is the view from India? So this is from some statistics from the census of 2011. The Central Statistics Organization in their report in 2011 said that 87.3% of PMI were out of the labor force. And a study by Nagaswamy et al. When it looked at people with mental illness, it found that 64.4% wanted a job and 90% of them desired rehabilitation in some form. So I think this is in line with view from the West and other literature that people with disability often want a job. They want rehabilitation. So sometimes care providers and even rehab professionals may come to the table with an idea that somebody with disability may not want to work, when in fact the opposite is true. When we look at the NMHS 2015 to 16, again, you've already probably all seen this, but this translates to a large number of Indians with some mental health disorder, and you can see that the percentages for lifetime severe mental illness and current severe mental illness are 1.9 and 0.8% respectively. Again, this translates into a large number of people. When we look at what the disability in severe mental illness was with regards to various people with various disorders, from major depressive disorder to psychotic disorders to alcohol use disorders, you can see here that disabilities in multiple spheres are experienced. And you can find that the percentages are quite high, ranging from between 20 and 30% for people with alcohol use disorders to around 70% in people with depression. But basically, it showed that 3/4 of persons with a significant mental illness had a significant disability in all three spheres. Sorry. Yeah. And we also, this study also showed that facilities which are essential, daycare centers, halfway homes, shelter workshops, temporary stay facilities, and the personnel that benefit people with disability are limited in number and mainly concentrated in cities or district headquarters. Excuse me. Sorry, thank you. Now, before we go on to models of rehabilitation, we need to understand what the role of daycare is. Now, daycare has many purposes: socialization, pre-vocational training, building self-esteem, social needs, reducing face time and relieving family members who are burdened, and thus changing EE or expressed emotion, promoting life skills such as travel, and symptom control and behavioral management. But we must understand this: daycare is not only a stepping stone to employment, but can be an end in itself. Now, this is an important point to keep in mind, that not everybody might desire employment, though employment is a felt need. And daycare itself can fulfill a number of purposes. Why am I telling you about this? Is because many state delivered daycare services initially looked at providing limits to daycare: 6 months, 1 year, things like that, or 3 months in some cases. Happily, that has been changing over time, but very often the concept of daycare is for somebody to be given pre-vocational training in daycare and then transition to employment. Whereas for some people, daycare itself is an end. So daycare doesn't always translate to employment. And in some cases, daycare isn't needed to transition to employment. But how do we do that? Or how can we see that occur? So when we look at vocational rehabilitation, we can see that vocational rehabilitation programs are designed to help people with disabilities obtain and maintain employment. And there are three major types of programs. There is what we call pre-vocational training, which basically looks at placing and training people. In this system, people are first trained and then placed in a particular job. This kind of pre-vocational training will focus on social skills training, cognitive training, and there will be some element of preparing people for job interviews and to fit in for potential employment. The next that we'll see is something called transitional employment. This, the Clubhouse model is the primary example that many of us may have known about or that we'll discuss. But it also includes in some ways shelter workshop and social enterprises. The last one that we should know about is perhaps the most important, or perhaps the one with the most evidence, and that is supported employment. These could be individual placement and support, augmented supported employment, but there are other types of supported employment that you will encounter. However, these two are the ones with the most evidence, and supported employment is different from the other two. We'll see why. So when you look at pre-vocational training, this is a stepwise approach. People get trained before they become employed. So there are various approaches that could be taken care of: training classes, job workshops, assessments, job counseling. Daycare can be one way of pre-vocational training. The focus here is twofold. One is on generic work skills. So often these will also include things like coming on time, grooming, interacting with others, knowing boundaries, knowing how to ask for help, knowing how to take supervision, dealing with criticism. These are some important parts of generic work skills that translate to multiple types of jobs. There may be also additional interventions to build self-esteem, to build assertiveness, and teaching how to manage stress. Social skills training, basically the basic model and the social problem solving model tend to be the two types that are taught, and cognitive training seem to be the mainstay. For transitional employment, this is interesting. These are segregated programs designed to help those who are not yet capable of working in a competitive employment setting. It is usually the first step to more gainful forms of employment. So one of these is what we traditionally know of as a sheltered workshop. Now, this is a segregated working environment where people with mental or physical disability work in groups and they acquire job skills and vocational experience. Often, some programs can be long-term placements. And sheltered workshops look at, very often, they remunerate people or they pay people less than what would be the competitive job employment market would provide. It's also important to understand that sheltered workshops may cater to many people. It may be primarily therapeutic for some people who are quite some distance away from being ready for work. Whereas for other people who are eager to work or who already have some skills, a sheltered workshop could be a short-term solution to prepare somebody for employment. A social enterprise is a semi-commercial business. Again, this offers paid employment and usually at more competitive rates than a sheltered workshop. This is again for people who have difficulty integrating into the regular workforce. But here, this will be an integrated working environment. It will include people with disability and people without disability. And usually there will be some access to more rewarding job opportunities. The clubhouse model is perhaps the index case where we discuss transitional employment. It's usually a building run by clients with severe mental illness along with staff. There are more than 300 clubhouses in various countries, including in India, specifically in Calcutta. And it's accredited by the International Center for Clubhouse Development. Now, clubhouses have two traditional components. There is what is called the work order day and transitional employment. The work order day is where somebody is part of the schedule of the clubhouse, perform certain duties in rotation or in shifts, and they learn many pre-vocational skills in this way. Transitional employment, on the other hand, is a competitive job. The difference between this and what we will see next is that the job is owned by the clubhouse. That is, the person may be there for 3 months or 6 months, after which this job will be transitioned to somebody else in the clubhouse. And the clubhouse will support this person as they pass through employment. So transitional employment is a stepping stone to competitive employment. Supported employment. Now, over time, there has been a rethink in the train and place model to a place and train model. And this looks at getting people into competitive employment quickly, providing them ongoing support to maintain employment. And the best research model has been the individual placement and support model. What are some of these principles? Now, there are 8 traditional principles, but these kind of tend to vary with where you read them from. But some of the most common, 8 common ones are a focus on competitive employment. There is zero exclusion. That is, the person does not the employer does not pre-decide, or the health service does not pre-decide who is fit for a job search and who is not. The job search tends to be rapid and starts as soon as possible. And clients discuss their preferences in service and job searches. There is usually an employment specialist who liaisons with employers and provides supports during employment. IPS is supposed to be time unlimited and it's supposed to be individualized for the person. There is an integration of vocational and clinical services. Now, one might look at this and say, well, in India, most vocational and clinical services are integrated. That's true. But you must understand that IPS arose in the context of the US, the UK, etc., where services tend to be different. So here, IPS was different in that both services would be provided in one place. This also meant that clients did not need to miss work on different days to access help from different service providers. And there is what is called personalized benefit counseling, which essentially refers to teaching the person with disability or helping the person with disability access the state given and private benefits which the person is due for, such as a disability pension, such as reasonable accommodation, and other things. I believe we've already discussed some of these, but these are the 8 principles. So which of these models is better? Keep in mind that the one model that I've not talked about is what is called self-employment. We'll come to that at the end. Now, when we look at systematic reviews and meta-analyses, IPS is seen to be superior to most traditional place and train model. If you look at pooled risk ratio for competitive employment, it's 2.4 times that for IPS over other services. And you can look at the confidence interval also is relatively small. This is from a review. And the other factors that IPS tends to improve are days in competitive employment, days in any form of paid employment, job tenure for competitive employment, job tenure for any paid employment, and time to first employment. So IPS is better in a number of ways. However, when certain review, at least the Cochrane review looked at it, it rated the quality of evidence as very low. One of the reasons for this reason for rating low was that there were a low number of studies contributing to specific outcomes. What do I mean by that? I mean things like, say, for example, days in competitive employment or days in any form of paid employment. Different studies have different indicators which they focus on, and some of them showed some change in these factors while others did not. Overall risk of bias was rated significantly, primarily because of who rated these outcomes. And post-hoc decisions affected the review process. In addition, recording of lengths of employment varied. So often in IPS, days to first employment is a common outcome that is recorded, whereas days spent in employment may not be. So though IPS is noted to have some effects on all of these, this is not uniform through all the various studies that have looked at the IPS in detail. Later reviews, of course, have given us additional information. There is some weaker evidence for enhanced quality of life and for clinical benefits. Some other comparisons: unemployment rates in geographic regions did not account for heterogeneity in IPS effectiveness, which suggests that it may have a role even in LAMIC countries or countries outside the US and the UK. There was better effectiveness with high GDP growth. For low GDP growths, pool risk ratios actually came down to 1.82. For example, like right now in the COVID-19 crisis, where GDP growths have been affected, we'll probably find again that employment for people with disability may take a bigger hit than for those without disability. That's something we hope to find out over time. Some of these studies have been done outside the US and UK or the European region, which is basically Japan and Hong Kong. But some factors which are not often measured but do play a big role are: what do different social security systems do? What do they incentivize? Will people lose welfare benefits if they attempt to be employed? Welfare benefits themselves, what is employment practice, and what do employment regulations say? So these are some of the factors which can affect somebody's employment and which may be difficult for even an RCT to control. A recent meta-analysis in PLOS 1 stated that there were better vocational outcomes. Any competitive employments around 1.63, job tenure you can find that was 0.55, job length, income. However, and this is the point that we were raising earlier, that non-vocational outcome estimates, though they were weakly effective, you can find that many of them crossed the zero mark. Many of the confidence intervals crossed the zero mark, and hence they were not significant. So quality of life, global functioning, mental health, these were not significant. And when this analysis was basically a specific expected proportion of studies with a true effect on non-vocational outcomes with a D of greater 0.2 was specifically looked at, there was some reason to expect a probable improvement for quality of life in at least some settings. So you can see here that for vocational outcomes, there is a clear benefit, whereas for non-vocational outcomes, there may be a benefit, but we probably require larger numbers and larger studies. What are some of the difficulties in implementing IPS? If this is so brilliant, why aren't we doing it already? Now, there are attitudinal barriers that relate to the beliefs of both clinicians and employers. That is the market ready to accept people with mental illness without questioning whether they're fit, without insisting on gatekeepers such as clinical organizations referring people on a particular basis. There could be contextual factors, the structure of the labor market themselves, welfare systems, organizational factors in mental health services. We did say that disability and employment and mental health services can be different. This is also true in India to some extent in terms of services. And the fidelity of IPS seems to be quite important. How can you implement IPS in the way that it is manualized? And this is difficult to achieve with separate services. In addition, IPS in terms of a service is a little more resource intensive. There are limits for the number of people that caseworkers can handle. And so when you look at the penetration of IPS supported employment in the US, this is from a 2016 review, it was extremely low. Around 5% of eligible adults with the psychiatric disability accessed IPS. So you can see that the penetration even in a relatively developed country was lower. Now, when we look at what is augmented IPS, we did talk about it briefly earlier. Now, some additions to IPS have been noted in terms of cognitive remediation, social skills training, and using other services like supported education, looking at prison populations and those with first episode psychosis. There, we find that IPS, if cognitive remediation and social skills are added, there is a benefit that we can see. There have also been some attempts at looking at whether IPS services can be delivered in a time-limited manner. And what those studies have shown is there's some benefit in terms of jobs secured, or time to first job. But there needs to be a lot more literature on these types of services. And for some studies, when IPS is delivered in a time-limited manner, effects over in the longer term, after the services are stopped, may not be very well sustained. What about our setting? And this is, we're coming to the end of our slides and we can take a few questions, is that there is a need for adapted models. Why do we say this? Now, our settings can be quite different. All right. If for all of you who are working in psychiatric settings, you might find that different people are at different stages of readiness in terms of their need to find work. So this is true even for our service in NIMHANS, when we have a psychiatric rehabilitation services runs a daycare service. And some people in the daycare service come with a need to move on to another job, whereas others come because daycare is their primary need. So one thing that I didn't say and that you should probably know is that IPS requires that your client be motivated. That is, the client should be clearly ready and willing to work. So that is in fact the only criteria that is there for IPS. They should be willing. You may not find that everybody is at this stage at the first time that you see them. So we will have to have a range of services which deals with people with different levels of disability, with different needs themselves, and which can serve the most people in the ways that they need. Now, when you look at certain culture-specific innovations, SCARF, for example, has looked at empowering families, offering simple culture-specific interventions like distribution of livestock and fishing nets. There could be differences in what we look at in an urban and a rural setting. And these are some important things to keep in mind, especially considering that we live in a Islamic country. And there's a need for more literature in the Indian setting, specifically on cost effectiveness, employer perspectives, quality of life, and family and clinical outcomes. One thing we have not talked about in this, but I think we've already covered, is that when we talk about competitive employment, we mean that competitive employment exists with reasonable accommodation. And without reasonable accommodation, competitive employment becomes hard to do. So this also, what we should keep in mind rather, is that work and supported employment, transitional employment is only one component of independent living. It's only viable in an ecosystem. So there may be need for other services like supported housing, supported education to complement these services. Some tenets of the RPWD including reservation and public sector jobs, 4% for people with disabilities, we need to keep in mind that people with mental illness are eligible for only 1%, along with people with intellectual disability, autism, SLD, and multiple disability. So when we talk about reservation in public sector jobs, we must keep in mind that the number of jobs through this will be relatively low compared to the number of people. Also, reservation in public sector jobs is meant to actually give people a voice and increase the participation of people with disability rather than serve an economic benefit alone. Whatever interventions we do in a local setting need to be sustainable, and therefore they need to be culture specific. Lastly, there is a great role for entrepreneurship. This includes self-employment, home-based employment, self-help groups. Now, this itself would be a seminar or a thing by itself, but I'll briefly tell you that there are various loans that can be available, including the National Handicap Finance Development Corporation. There are other skill building organizations, such as the Skill Council for Persons with Disability, that look at special innovations to skill people to allow them to seek employment. So at the end of the day, what should you do? Should you do train and place, or should you do place and train? The ideal is probably that we try and place and train as many people as possible. However, when we place and train, we must keep in mind that we have to help these people wherever they are placed. We may need to liaise with employers. We may need to help people deal with stress. We may need to help people deal with symptoms in the course of their jobs. There will be a certain set of people who will need to be trained and placed. And this mostly is dependent on what they are ready for. So with what we will need to look at what clients' objectives are, what their needs are. And we need to understand that daycare and vocational rehabilitation services are related, but they're actually two separate types of services, and they serve a different basket of needs. In a Venn diagram, they intersect, but they also contain aspects which either does not hold for the other. So with that, I think I'll close the presentation and we'll open up for questions. These are some of the references that we've had. So if there's anything that you want to ask me, I think we can open up the presentation. We've covered basically 3 types of employment and briefly self-employment. So if there's anything you want to ask me about some of these, we can go ahead. I also should say that I haven't covered a few topics, but this is why you'll have to go back and read about them. You should go and know something about the provisions of the RPWD. This topic would also need you to know a little bit about labor laws and how they reflect. I do need to tell you that there's a large debate about sheltered workshops themselves. At one level, sheltered workshops have been criticized for paying people at less than minimum wage, in basically meaning that they continue to treat people with disability as separate and different and not deserving the same remuneration as other people. On the other hand, there have been instances where, or rather, response to this is that people with disability, in the absence of sheltered workshops, certain types of people with, or certain persons with disability may not get any opportunities for employment. And there are certain specific permissions under law or by governments for sheltered workshops to run in certain countries. The US, for example, the Americans with Disability Act itself doesn't contain this, but certain state governments and central governments may give permissions to run sheltered workshops with wages at less than the minimum wage in order to allow for these workshops to exist. I think India, again, is one of those countries where we don't have a specific law that covers sheltered workshops. But this is also something that you should think about. Yeah, I think there are some questions from chat. You can unmute your mic and ask. Rehabilitation for marital breakdown. Now, that's a hard question. I'm not sure what you're asking about there. When we look at rehabilitation in the traditional way that it is about optimizing somebody's quality of life and helping them achieve their potential and helping them find peace with their lives. So I would think that in terms of marital breakdown, your focus would be more about counseling services and about legal avenues to protect somebody's rights. But in terms of marital breakdown itself, unless there's a little bit more to the question, perhaps we could the person could unmute and say, what is the current scenario of rehabilitation services in our country? Now, that's again a difficult question. I think it's too much for us to cover in this thing. They do exist. Shelter workshops exist in quite a few places. There are projects which run, such as the Thrive project, Inspire projects, which trying and look at how competitive employment can be given, or how certain innovative employments can be, people can participate in group employment. So there are organizations like SCARF, which look at trying and employing people and trying and getting people into employment. There are other organizations like EMAT, which looks at involving volunteers in terms of helping people with access to microloans or microcredit. There are also organizations like the Chelamuthu Trust, which looks at some interventions for rural settings like animal husbandry and other types of employment. So there are a number of services across the country. Are there enough? Absolutely not. And when you talk about rehabilitation services, as I said, given the RPWD Act and given the MHCA, there is a definite onus on the government to provide rehabilitation services. There are likely, for example, for daycare itself, the Mansadhara program in Karnataka, for example, looks at providing daycare. Now, what I would want to tell you is that it's important to look at what is going on in your state. And often there will need to be a dialogue between people who run these services and clinicians and people in government institutes and in institutes like ours, because how long do people remain in such services? Should daycare services be time limited or should they not? Now, we know that the science tells us something, but it is also a matter of resources and how much is available to a particular state, to a particular district to run these services. So that is something that we'll have to look at. So it's actually quite varied. We're a country where these services themselves vary, but there are examples that we can look to and talk about. I think we've covered that, or we've covered that already in other sessions. I think Dr. Amol Chavan says in a place and train model, there'll be a lot of difficulties in managing persons in work center in case emergency. That's a good question. If I harken back to my slides, you'll remember that I said that there needed to be liaison even when the person was in a job. So when you look at the IPS, the person, it isn't really fire and forget. When somebody goes into employment, there will be a job coach who will help the person adapt. There will be that job coach may have to liaison with the employers to provide reasonable accommodation. The person may require a short absence to, say, for example, get admitted, come back and then get back to work. So employment doesn't mean being treated like everybody else. I think the best example that we can think of is that, I don't know if any of you have seen the cartoon of children trying to watch a cricket match over a fence. And you'll find that the child who is very short requires a bigger box to stand on to look over the fence than the child who is already very tall. So it's important to note that one size does not fit all. And there will be some difficulties, but from what the evidence tells us, place and train is more effective at getting people into work than any other type of service, especially where the person themselves is ready to work and is clearly expressing a preference to work. However, I will take your point that in somebody who is not yet ready to go back to work, place and train may not be the best option. Or somebody who is very acutely ill, you may find that it may not work as well in certain circumstances. But in people, it's a good idea to try and see whether it's acceptable, because one of the barriers, if you'll note, has been that clinicians themselves and employers themselves don't offer services to people with disability because they worry that they won't be able to handle it. And that is probably quite a bit of an overestimate. Okay. Any website for information about government vocational and rehabilitation centers in Karnataka? Excuse me. I'll come back to you. I think there are offhand right now. I can't remember any. The National Trust, if you're looking for National Trust website that lists all of these. Yeah, I'll have to come back to that question a little later. Any vocational rehabilitation courses available in India for psychiatrists? Okay, we offer one. We offer a fellowship in mental health rehabilitation, and we have a PhD course. There aren't too many which focus specifically on this, but there are psychiatric services which do integrate a lot of these options. For example, I think it is Chandigarh, is it? I think where GMCH, where there is a large number of these services are integrated into what the center provides. Similarly, centers like CMC Vellore, SCARF do have a focus on vocational rehabilitation. The role of occupational therapist in vocational rehabilitation, there's a large role. In fact, when you look at it, there is, we need to understand that when we look at vocational rehabilitation, it isn't a single discipline approach. It is always a multidisciplinary approach. You will find that there needs to be social skills training, there need to be cognitive adaptation training, cognitive remediation. So you'll inevitably find that there needs to be a psychiatrist, there needs to be a psychologist, social worker, often nursing, nurses and the nursing team are an important part of activities of daily living, life skills. You'll also find that occupational therapists are extremely good in their role as job coaches. And in a daycare setting, ideally you would want an occupational therapist to be a part of allotting specific tasks to people to best maximize their ability to integrate. And when you look at coming back to these courses, though they're not specific to psychiatrists, there are some courses now which are slowly arising in terms of job coaches. And the RCI also, some institutes under RCI do look at giving specific diplomas and other things in vocational rehabilitation. Again, these are primarily for occupational therapists, social workers, psychologists, but they are open. All right. Please specify about community rehabilitation. I see, when I talked about what I was talking about now, this primarily is based in a center. However, ideally IPS services should be in a community. That is, they should be integrated. If you looked at what I said, the clinical services and vocational services need to be integrated. So when we talk about community rehabilitation, we must understand that we need to think about the future and how we will distribute the existing resources. So the DMHP program itself has a social worker, psychologist, along with a psychiatrist. So they, rather they have psychologists, they have nursing professionals. And so there is scope to actually implement some of these in a community program per se. Would it be better if there were additional professionals? Absolutely. But there is definitely a lack of services overall. And not just in India, this is true across the world. But for us, it can be more acute in some ways. And I think more when you look at community rehabilitation, it also matters as to what you're telling people to do. So urban and rural areas will have different solutions to the same problem. People might have to actually look at entrepreneurship, for example, differently in different settings. And it's important to remember that people might need different interventions at different points. So somebody who needs daycare when they are extremely ill only may be ready to go into competitive employment once they get well. And this is also a feature that mental illness tends to be dynamic. That is, people can be very ill and then in between, intermorbidly, they can actually be quite well. So when you look at disability itself and you look at mental illness itself, different people will need individualized interventions. Right. What more steps should be taken to destigmatize the viewpoint of people towards mentally ill at workplaces? Plus, what do you think we need to treat the co-workers so that they cope with the working pattern of the patient? That's a very good question. This is something that we've actually experienced. One thing is that workplaces, the best way to destigmatize is to actually have people with disability work in the organization. That's the best possible step, because people usually, when they interact with somebody with disability, many myths can be debunked at that stage. When you look at specifically, I think it's important to have in organizations, it's important to identify certain key figures or key leaders who will be able to push the organization to try to do something. Because once they're able to try to do something, then they're able to actually take this on board. I think it's important to, there was a person who started the SAP Labs program for autism. And one of the things he tells people is that you must be able to argue at different levels. You must be able to argue at the level of the head, at the level of the heart, and the level of the wallet. And people often, what people don't understand is that the things that are good for people with disability tend to be things that are good for everybody. So say, for example, when people in an organization see that people with disability are being supported, they themselves may come up with their own problems, which they may have been hiding, which may have made them less productive, which may have made them less able to participate, and they are able to seek help, lower the stigma for themselves as well. When often one thing that is done in companies which do try and include people with disability is that there's a buddy system. There are mentors in the company who do try and handhold somebody with disability as they get included into the organization. That's a very good step. There must be some liaison between the health service or the vocational rehab service and the employer. Without that, it's very difficult to continue this. And it's important that employers should know that if there's a problem, what do I do? So for most employers, or rather a large proportion of employers, the most frequent question is, what will we do if they turn violent? But from what we've all seen, violence in terms of an overall setting is relatively rare. That is, people with mental illness are more often the sufferers of violence than people who are violent themselves. So it's important to try and talk to leaders, talk about some of these myths and how they can be debunked, get a few people into the organization. Often when an organization hires a few people, they'll be willing to hire a few more people. But this nothing of the traditional way that we've done this in group educational programs, awareness programs. These are useful, but more useful than them is liaison. At this moment, liaison is very, very important. In terms of technology, again, technology can play a role in doing specific things. So say, for example, there's some evidence that job interviews, etc., can be enhanced with, say, virtual reality based programs. However, there's not a lot of evidence, and it's hard to actually roll out such programs overall in detail. There are certain things that can be done that technology can do, but it may not fit everywhere. One example could be that, say, for example, in the US, Google, I don't know if anybody here has heard about Google Glass or remembers Google Glass rather. It was basically a pair of eyeglasses with a camera, and which was integrated, which had some integration with or rather had networking abilities. And so it was finally dropped by Google because it wasn't a success. And many people were, as you can imagine, not too happy with the idea of somebody walking around with a camera on their glasses. However, it has had a second life in assembly line manufacturing, because there it allows people to kind of review manuals or review clear steps in an assembly line process as they do their work. It allows them also to quickly contact their supervisor. So there's a clear use case where it's benefiting somebody. And I would argue that technology benefits people where there's a specific use case scenario. I don't think blanket saying that technology is going to help will always work. Technology may help in overcoming specific challenges. So it's more important. This is where, again, an occupational therapist will probably be of great use. Because if you look at what an occupational therapist does, he breaks down a job into specific roles. And he looks at how these roles can be, he or she looks at how these roles can be achieved. And there you might find a role for technology at home. I also believe that certain things like having a pool of jobs for people with disability in a large database, which people can easily access, so people can then apply easily. I think those are some potential solutions at the macro level, which could help people who are searching for a job. That is, employers who are willing to hire somebody with disability, like a Yellow Pages or so, put out their job thing. Right now, it's happening in job portals and other places. However, I think having a centralized database, for example, I do know that one organization, again, I think it's related to SAP Labs again, looked at in the US matching strengths of people with autism spectrum disorders with requirements on a job portal which listed out what a person needs to do. So I think at that level, yes, it can help. But I think when you're looking at specifically to what one person needs, I think you'll have to look at what the job requires, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and how that particular intervention would help.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking this session. So this session will also be uploaded in the YouTube in a couple of days. So you can also go through our YouTube channel there. And our YouTube channel is Nimhans Indians. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to access all our videos in the YouTube channel. So it also consists not only of PRS, various other topics are also available. Right now we have about 37 sessions uploaded in the YouTube channel. So you can all go through that.
Chetan, can I have one last thing?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, sir.
There is actually, I just remembered, there is an online directory of vocational rehab services that, or other rehabilitation services that has been created. That's not only in Karnataka, across the country. This was done by some of our colleagues in social work, psychiatric social work, Dr. Amir Hamza specifically, and Dr. Jagdisha, who is a part of psychiatric rehab services and who currently heads the unit. So this is the RAB app. So I think I'll ask Chetan that if he can circulate information about that to all of you who are part of this session, you can actually go and try and look at that app, especially when you're looking for rehab centers. Thanks, Chetan. Sorry, just wanted to add.
Yes, I think last time when Dr. Jagdisha sir had taken the session, he also had mentioned about RAH, R-A-H, the online directory wherein one can access. For South India, at least, there is also a book which was mentioned by Dr. Jagdisha last time, that that is also available, that to find where rehab services are available. Also, although a small directory, there is also another directory which is available at WAPR in India chapter website. State-wise list of rehab services available. Apart from this, if one wants to actually look at the data on only things related to National Trust Act of '99, that is whether there is a local level committee, some NGOs working on people with mental retardation, autism, cerebral palsy, etc. The nationaltrust.org has in its website the list. You can search actually according to the district as to whether there is a local level committee or a NGO working on any of the areas which are covered under NT. It also provides us some details on, according to NTA, Disha, or any other programs, any of the 10 programs which are under National Trust Act, whether they are covered in that district or that state also.
Yeah. The NGOs under the National Trust can basically run 2 of the programs at one time. So you will find a list of multiple NGOs usually under various states and under various districts, and that's a useful resource, especially for people with ASD and IDD. Okay, then shall we close then for now?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much, Deepak sir. We also thank Linux Laboratories Chennai for their support through educational grant. Thank you, Anand. We'll meet you next week, next Saturday on Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Talk.